Hello, welcome. We've put together this short video of 9 names that we find to be particularly poignant in understanding a more accurate account of Europe's past. To give some context, here's some information about our work. We look for signs that Celtic ideals of equality and partnership between men and women have somehow survived. As more and more of the Iron Age picture fills out across Europe, we see the rich, connected, egalitarian world of our ancestors. We love filling in the blanks before and after year 0.
Typically, we find troves of information in areas of greatest religious presence. Why? Because the Christian conquest clamped down on resistance by chopping people and places apart. Think of it this way. If you're conquering people, you go after their areas of greatest concentration and weaken them. How? You split one duchy into 3 nations. Or, if there is a cluster of public fest halls in a city where people gather, you control them by installing your own emissaries and tightening access. We see how the church-state quelled resistance by dividing areas into different nationalities and languages. The fest halls stood at the very heart of Celtic society. Everything happened there. Changing halls into churches put them under Rome's control and turned strong Celtic autonomy into subservience to Rome.
Here's what we'd like you to do. Let's put ourselves in the mindset of Caesar. You know there's a rich, flourishing culture across Europe with trade routes and a fest hall at every junction. You've been welcomed into that culture as an emissary. But you want something else. Women there rebuffed you. Can't have that. They need to bow down like Roman women. You want to slash them to the ground. And you don't want them to know it's you who's doing it.
We need to remember that the pre-Christian culture flourished from Britain into Turkey. Caesar came into Northern Europe, saw a prosperous egalitarian society, and set about to destroy it and to take the spoils back to Rome. Rome subjugated women all across all the lands that it conquered and occupied. No rights, couldn't own or inherit property. You were owned by your father or your husband. And that's why we have to talk about this, because this same conquest mentality is still at work. Conquerors want to suppress fact-based thought and science. Caesar may have invaded Northern Europe for its gold and its slaves, but against women, Rome seems to hold a 2,000-year grudge. And for what? For resisting enslavement? Discrimination against women has become so ingrained that we don't even see it anymore. It's all around us. You can't fight it if you can't see it. We need to consciously step back and assess the reasons why women have been suppressed. It's because we've been taught that women are secondary, generation after generation.
So that's the backdrop. Now let's look at some finds. Naming pops up as especially significant this trip. So we'd like to explore some names with you. We'll start with Mary, which is perhaps the touchiest since it's been so interwoven into Christian doctrine. And that may be the very reason to consider it. We think that the Celts venerated Mary as a hero before the Christian conquest. So of course Christianity took over the name because that's what Rome always does. What is the origin of Mary? Logically, this comes as no surprise. Mary comes from Miriam, the most common Jewish name in the early days of Christianity.
If you look at this Regensburg mural in terms of both the tenor and the subject matter, it seems Celtic and not Christian. From heroic epic traditions and from Caesar's own writings, we know that Celtic women were warriors. Women were instrumental in ridding Europe of imperial Rome, so of course the Roman portrayal of women would be unfavorable. With that in mind, a triumphant woman with her foot on the head of a snake is too far a stretch to be Christian. It looks too Celtic, and it is at loggerheads with a Christian story of women. The location of this mural also bears notice. It's on the Danube, in the very heart of Celtic Europe. The Rhine and the Danube form the main river corridors, waterways early immigrants followed for thousands of years. The Celts in pre-Christian times called it Ratisbona. Who is this woman? We do not yet have an answer, but we see some interesting connections with other imagery, and the woman is said to be Mary. We suspect this to be a camouflaged tribute to Celtic women who resisted the Roman overlords. It might have been a way to circumvent heresy laws. Recall that heresy laws banned all secular expression for 1400 years. Even a family portrait was punishable by death unless it had some religious aspects to it. Other places in Europe pose intriguing possibilities for hidden meanings too. In Marienmünster, Mary looks remarkably like a bishop. Does this suggest that women druids were supplanted by male bishops? One thing seems certain. For Mary to have been the leading role in Christianity, Mary was first a Celtic hero.
Magdalena. We went to Europe looking for Magdalena because we had seen so many places named after Magdalena in past trips. Hilltops are named Magdalena in Croatia, Slovenia, Austria, and Germany, and 2 of them are hot springs. The sculpture of a woman's head that was uncovered in the Austrian Magdalena site might honor a hero consistent with Celtic practices. We found Magdalena in France in a very exciting way. 2 museums in the Périgord reveal archaeological indications of a geologic era named Magdalena that occurred just after the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago. That period is noteworthy for a number of breakthroughs, including the depiction of the female form, the domestication of small animals, and the development of freestanding shelters. Of special note, the area included in the Magdalene Age appears to match up with the Hallstatt era, some 12,000 years later. Usually the name Magdalena is linked with the later biblical Mary Magdalene, but now we see earlier associations. The Magdalenan era was named after the place where the post-Ice Age findings were made. Some authorities interpret Magdalena as from Magdala on the Sea of Galilee. Please stay tuned. This is a developing line of study, and of course it's a big jump forward from the Magdalenan era, 12,000 years into the Iron Age.
The name Lucy. Naming a town after a woman without calling her a saint deserves attention. And here's why. One sign of the Christian conquest is the Roman commandeering of names along with people, places, and goods. The name Lucy-le-Bois contains 2 typically Celtic features. It gives its geographic description in the woods, bois, and it is also likely honoring a hero. Even in the pre-Christian times, Celts paid homage to their heroes in halls designed specifically for that purpose. Later, statues of heroes were placed in alcoves of buildings. But names may survive longer than statues, and the Celts seem to have realized that. So we visited Lucy-le-Bois, because places that retain their Celtic origins often retain other Celtic characteristics. The village of Lucy-le-Bois also shows signs of a Celtic past with its typical configuration of marketplace, parks, and public halls. And even the street names in Lucy-le-Bois aid navigation. The path behind the wall is called the path behind the wall. Other aptly named streets lead to burial grounds, vineyards, and meadows. Lucy means light, which remained important to every passing generation. In navigational terms, Lucy sits in forests that used to be the largest in Gaul, significant because of the resources the woods have always provided to humans. Traces of two different sets of walls around the inner village tell that this small cluster of people prepared for attack at least 2 different times. We don't know yet who Lucy was, but she's clearly an important figure. At least 5 places in France are named after Lucy.
Joan. Joan of Arc seems the classic misfit for the Christian takeover. Aside from the fact that she's a female warrior, an anathema to Rome, she was considered a heretic and burned at the stake, and then, well, she's a saint. That's a rough storyline. The only way to make sense of it is through the Celtic lens. Think of a consistent Celtic culture all across Europe that was chopped into a rabbit warren of countries and languages. For 4 centuries, crusades of armed monks ravaged broad swaths of Europe's resident populations. In the 15th century, the Christian conquest swallowed the last free counties of Burgundy and rebranded Europe the Habsburg Empire. The 15th century was open season on women. Women were burned at the stake in massive numbers, fleeing to safe houses and castles. They were hidden in secret chambers, with their hair cut to look like men and wearing cloaks to hide their female form. They were pulled out of their houses and run through with swords. Even the statues of women were smashed and beheaded. And within that bloody carnage, when Europe bled rivers from the relentless slaughter of females, we are expected to believe that in this same church state that wreaked mayhem on women, suddenly there was a St. Joan? No, when you see a medieval woman with a sword, she's fighting for her life, and it's her Celtic comrades who venerate her. Then that Celtic veneration will be called Christian by the Christian Church because that's the way it's done. That Christian statue of Joan of Arc that you see in the now called churches may have been through many iterations, but she's a Celtic warrior. Even if we don't know every detail of what really happened, we know the context. With the extent of homage still being paid to Joan of Arc, it's safe to say that she was beloved by Celts and raised up as the symbol for the warrior for European freedom. She represents untold numbers of females burned at the stake, whose names and faces we will never see.
Catherine. We think that the Cathars were a family and that the name Catherine carries their southwestern French heritage. Here's why. Cathars were also a group singled out. In fact, they were targeted by a specific military crusade launched against them by Rome. Catherine is, of course, identified as a Christian saint, but she is always shown with a wheel. This leads us to believe she may have invented the 8-spoke wooden wagon wheel.
Beatrice. The story of Beatrice gives a special view into medieval Europe from the perspective of the divided and conquered. Beatrice was an 11th century abbess at Quedlinburg, an abbey with a long tradition of women abbesses and secularity. Beatrice's tenure was particularly noteworthy for the collaboration between women and Jews, two groups singled out and oppressed by heresy laws. Jews who had been displaced from their homelands received abbey lands at Beatrice's direction. Today in the abbey in Quedlinburg, Beatrice is barely mentioned. In the place of highest honor is an outsized cross with a body hanging from it. The life and vitality that one can imagine 1,000 years ago has been replaced by a death threat that hangs heavy in the air. No photos are allowed. We have found considerable evidence to suggest that the cross was used in Celtic culture as a symbol for birth and death, a crossroads, the way to define the beginning and the end of life. To commemorate the end of life, crosses were often decorated by softening the ends of the cross squares, edges, and junctures, the way decoration softens the cross ribs of a vaulted ceiling. Christianity changed the tenor of the fest halls from a celebration of life to the threat of death.
Agnes. Along with Beatrice, Agnes was also an abbess of Quedlinburg, preceding Beatrice by some 500 years. Agnes was also associated with another Celtic family, the Franks. What sparked our attention was a devotion to her memory that we see in her hometown of Straubing, Germany. Many alcoves there show her likeness, in the fest hall and also in the exteriors of commercial buildings.
Julian. In support of our theory that the Christian conquest changed the imagery of women to men, here is Julian. This person is certainly a warrior and certainly looks like a woman. This could also be a way to circumvent heresy laws, which you will remember were essentially Rome's version of mind control. You make all the heroes into men.
Bridget brings Ireland to Essen. Her medieval Irish-German secular abbey connections are fascinating and speak to the networks of the Celtic Europe. In Ireland, Bridget was known as a leading jurist, sometimes referred to, are you ready for this? The Mary of the Gael. Her name is associated with the abbey at Essen, Germany, around the time of Charlemagne. And if you think about it, Essen is just at the junction of the Rhine and Ruhr rivers, so a natural focal point for trade and commerce in the heart of Europe, part of Gaul. Bridget is known as a defender, poet, healer, metallurgist, and domesticator of animals, the latter evoking memories of Magdalena. We hope that you found these names as intriguing as we do and hope to see you again soon. Let's keep searching. These lines of distinction between Celts and Romans are becoming more and more visible. We are seeing more clearly the dilatory effects Roman religion has had, particularly by singling out women. Its armed forces devastated much of Europe. It is exclusive and divisive, and it has no place in governance. To protect our freedom, it's important to understand what's at stake. We must guard against division and conquest and keep a wonderful, productive balance. Liberty for all. We wish the very best of days.
Thank you.